Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Inky Thoughts podcast. Today is a little bit, admittedly, a selfish episode of mine, as we're probably going to dive more into the sociology regarding tattoos than ever before. As I have a guest on that I would possibly say is the true contender for the title I've stolen from him, possibly on social media, of being the tattoo sociologist. Not only is he more tattooed than me, he's also got a degree level, one could say, above my own, with me having a master's and him having a PhD and also lecturing and stuff like that. I would say he's way further than me there. And for this episode, he might be the actual tattoo sociologist. But without going too much into detail yet, we're going to be talking about his research about tattoos. And I think he would like to introduce himself now. So, Michael, if you please.
Hi, Madja. Thanks very much for having me. So, a very good introduction. I think you've covered the main things. So, I'm Michael Rees, and I am indeed, I guess, a tattoo sociologist. That Twitter handle. Although I don't do so much with tattoos anymore, but my PhD thesis was about tattoos, and I have subsequently turned that into a book that came out just over a year ago now. So yeah, I've had a long-term interest in tattoos and subsequently an academic interest in tattoos.
Yes, not only that, but a personal interest, I would also argue as well.
Yeah.
It is at least way more glaring on Michael than this on myself if we are both wearing a hoodie, as he is today. Who of us has the most tattoos, I would argue.
Maybe, yeah. Yeah, I think from the descriptions of your tattoos on previous episodes of your podcast, I think we're probably fairly similar in terms of arms and chest. But I don't know if you put a video out of this, but I've got my neck then and my hands now, which I had then. I mean, my hands I got done just after I got my first academic job. It was like my treat to myself because I'd always wanted hands and neck tattoos. But living in the world that we do, that often tattooed people do face discrimination in the employment market, even in quite a liberal area such as sociology lecturing, I was a bit worried about getting my hands and neck. And I always said, well, I'll get it done once I've got a permanent academic job and I pass probation. And then I think I'd been in my job for about a month when I was like, I'm going to get my hands done. And then my neck didn't follow for a while. I had my neck done about 2.5 years ago now.
Oh, it was quite recent, the neck at least.
Yes, yeah, compared to some of my work, certainly.
But I get how you feel, because that was my idea when I was aiming for the PhD as well, till mid last year, that was going to be my treat, that after my first real academic position, I was going to go for the hands, because I do want to cover most of my body as well. So I've always had that dream. Of course, if I get any work to do with within the actual tattoo world at some point, it's gonna be a bit more for free fall, I think. But
yes, yeah, it's certainly, I think, more jobs where you are able to be more freely tattooed, and those where it's still a little restrictive.
I'd say at least in Britain, I find, even more so than most places. I can mostly speak for having lived in the south of England at one point and then lived in Scotland recently. Especially Scotland, I found, was so liberal when it came to people's appearance. Like, I've never before tried, for example, being my English is failing me for a moment here. Never tried being handled by a bank teller that had tattoos, like visible tattoos, before. But I did that in Scotland a couple of times, where even people working in a bank were like, "Oh, there's a bit of stuff poking out on the wrists or on the neck and stuff like that." That was quite fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think you'll probably find the CEOs of the banks and the board members are probably not tattooed, or most of them not. But certainly attitudes are softening. I think there's what I term an aura of deviance around them. I think that long legacy of tattoos being viewed as, deviants or criminals got them still persists in some areas, but I think it's been demystified a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at I think a mutual acquaintance of ours, Matt Lauder, and his work on it, where he's done a lot to demystify this idea that, it's still apt to say, oh, it used to be for sailors and hookers and bikers and that, but where he's been very adamant about that. No, we've been saying that for almost 150 years now. We've got to stop saying that.
Yeah, so I read Matt's PhD when I was doing my own PhD and cited it actually. But Matt released a book last year as well, I think it was, which really shows how wide and varied tattooing has been throughout history. It really challenges this idea that, you know, it was just kind of sailors and hookers and criminals that got them, and then footballers and rock stars started getting them, and then everyone started getting them. And actually, the history of tattooing is significantly more complex than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that stood out to me, not that we're going to talk about a different academic's book too much in your episode, but was the thing with the Esquire magazine article he pulled out that was from the early 1900s, where it's just like, even then they were telling middle-class women in the States to get a tattoo or two because that was the highest fashion, and you're kind of a boring fishes, we say in Denmark sometimes, if you don't have that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I'm curious now, Michael, talking about this, but talking a bit about your own tattoo journey, so to speak, to use a bit of a fashionable term at the moment. What came first for you, academic interest or tattoos?
No, the tattoos first. So I had my first tattoo in 1999,
Wow.
which might age me a little bit. And much like yourself, I think, you know, I was really, or still am, but into a kind of lot of rock music, a lot of alternative music, and, you know, all the bands that I were into, you know, they had tattoos. And my reasoning for getting one was because I thought it was kind of quite edgy and rebellious, like a lot of the kind of musicians that I listened to. And, you know, I was the only one among my group of friends who had a tattoo in the kind of rock nightclub that I used to frequent. It was very unusual then for people to have tattoos. I think looking back now, I think tattoos were already starting to become popularized. I was probably less edgy and less of a rebel as I like to think of myself. So yeah, certainly I had a personal interest in tattoos. I've got a tiny little tribal one, although I'm uncomfortable with the terminology tribal now as I've learned more academically, but is it a frequently used, you know, style of tattooing that I had done, and then I had a couple more pieces, and then I had those ones covered over with kind of bigger pieces as I learned a bit more about tattooing. And then I started my sociology degree in 2004. And then in the second year, I did a module about the body and sociology. And I was astonished that sociology had stuff to say about the body. It was still a fairly emerging discipline then, about sort of 10-ish years old. And I studied tattooing for that module. And then I did my undergraduate dissertation on body modification more generally.
All right.
On to masters, and then obviously carried it on to PhD as well eventually.
And you did it all about tattoos?
Yeah, well, the undergraduate dissertation was about body modification more broadly, so I looked at piercing as well. But yeah, masters dissertation and my PhD is solely focused on tattooing. And,
we might be. I mean, if you were even older, I could have been a fucking reincarnation of you, Michael. Like I've been exactly the same I did. Except my undergrad, to my dismay, was I mainly wanted to do it about tattoos, but they sort of forced it because of even in 2010 when I started it, and in 2013 when I finished my undergrad in the south of England, I was still sort of thin on the ground with tattoo research, so I had to add in some stuff about body modification more broadly as well. And it was a good thing because, you know, you see some of the connections between the different forms of body modification and other ways of adorning the body with different stuff and that. But I originally just wanted to, you know, hyper focus on the tattoo stuff.
Yeah, I think In my experience, most people with tattoos also have piercings. I mean, I
A lot,
don't
at least.
have any piercings anymore, but
So,
certainly when I started getting tattooed, I also experimented with piercings. I had a lot of piercings, my eyebrow, my tongue, and things, as ways to kind of express my identity. And again, this kind of edgy rebelliousness that I was trying to kind of be at the time. Perhaps it's no surprise I ended up in sociology. It's kind of a bit of a home for rebels.
I mean, I wasn't ever the rebel, but I was always the weirdo and sort of the outsider, which I think also very much fits the bill. Like there's a lot of us in sociology. Even when
Yes.
you look back at some of the older guys in sociology, like people often remember, I think it was Foucault as the guy with the leather jacket who came on a motorcycle, which was very edgy in his day, and yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. There's a lot of weirdos in our field, and good on us actually. But also,
Uh,
as you know as well, especially us who like to look at tattoos within sociology, often also fall. If we weren't already into tattoos, we seem to quite quickly get attracted to it when we start researching it.
yeah, I don't think I've come across any sociologists studying tattoos that aren't tattooed themselves, actually.
Yeah,
Whether that comes kind of before or after,
yeah.
I'm not sure. I know Michael Atkinson's got a very seminal book about tattooing, and I think he sort of had some tattoos but became more heavily involved in tattooing as he was researching.
I think
Um,
that's right.
yeah, certainly I found myself wanting lots of tattoos when I was researching, but then I was a PhD student, so I had very limited income in order to be able to afford the tattooing. And my own tattoo journey has gone through kind of peaks and troughs, actually. I will
Mm.
have periods where I get tattooed quite a lot and then go many years without having anything done.
Mm.
As kind of, as you know, tattooing is expensive and you have other pressures on your
Oh, I
income.
know.
I've
It's
got kids
triple
now.
the price here than it
Oh
is in
wow.
Britain. Yeah.
I mean, everything's expensive in Denmark.
Oh, I know, but that was the thing I used to love when going to Britain because I've always loved the British tattoo scene, and I did get some done when I moved to Glasgow.
Mm.
Uh, but very quickly when I started having a British pay, it became way more expensive to me. Uh, getting tattoos
Yes,
as soon as
yeah.
my money was like situated in the UK, but it was still in Denmark, and the transfer rate was kind of good to me and all that. Easy to get tattoos because I'd pay 400, 500 quid for a day session with the artists I knew in Scotland who were amazing artists, and that'll be just a couple hours here.
Wowzers, yeah. I
Yeah.
had my tattoos in America, which is
Oof.
also a very, very expensive place to be tattooed in,
Yeah, I've heard.
particularly New York, where I was.
Oof.
Um, yeah, it was. I think I paid about $300 for quite a small tattoo that would have probably been around 60 or 70 pounds here. So
Fuck,
maybe 3 or 4 times the price. Yeah.
But it is worth it, though. Like, that's the
Yeah, I
thing.
wanted a kind of commemoration of kind of being in New York, as well as this tattoo that I'd wanted for a long time, which was the logo of my favorite band. So, um,
I think you talked about this in your book, at least briefly as well, about this journal idea with tattoos as well. That they sort of do, whether they're tied directly to it or not, as far as I understood, uh, they still sort of encapsulate the moments. Like you get something that doesn't have anything to do with New York City imagery wise, but the fact that you get it done in New York and while you're there visiting by an artist in New York, that still sort of incorporates that into it.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I found in my research, I'm sure you found this as well from talking to people, that people often feel like they have to have a story about their tattoos
Mm.
now. And programs such as kind of Miami Ink and London Ink and so forth have really emphasized this narrative nature of tattoos, that you can't just have something because you like pretty pictures anymore. There has to be some kind of deep and meaningful story about why you want it. And what was interesting with my respondents is a lot of them would admit that actually there wasn't that much meaning behind some of their tattoos, but it would remind them of a place or a time that, and they felt like they needed to give that
Aye.
that justification very often.
But that's the thing. Like, I think I find especially with people like me who love to go to conventions and who want to be very tattooed and that you very quickly you might start out as I did with wanting meaningful tattoos and that when you don't think you're going to get that many and you really want to have a story behind them. But it's very quickly it becomes way more about being tattooed and liking the artwork on your body than necessarily needing a great story behind it.
Yeah, I mean, personally, not that I'm saying there's anything wrong for people who have stories about around their tattoos. You know, I know lots of people who have had tattoos to commemorate, as we've just been talking, to kind of resonate with friendships, to kind of give this sense of who they are. But for me personally, none of my tattoos have meanings except the band ones, which obviously resonate with the bands that I particularly like.
That's the thing. It might play into. Do correct me, as it's your theory, so to speak. But that's sort of what I think about with your hunt for authenticity with tattoos. That people sometimes misunderstand this the identity aspect of tattoos. That it doesn't need the story thing, but it can still very much be about figuring out yourself. Still, like there's still this aspect to it of for lack of a better term, which is one known term for academics like me and Michael, reclaiming the self in a way, or rather perhaps claiming the self in a way.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple of things there. I know that you've mentioned Paul Sweetman's work, which was very influential for me. One of the few people who's really done empirical research on tattooing in the UK, at least. Most of it comes from America. And he talks about anchoring and the self, you know, giving oneself kind of permanent markers of the reminder of whatever that may be. And that was really something that came out of my research, and the sociological literature around authenticity, and probably in other areas, philosophy, psychology, and so forth, is extremely broad. But for the people I researched, authenticity was real to them, you know, having this idea of an authentic self. And for the majority of the people I interviewed, tattoos allowed them to do that, because of the commitment, because it is very often expensive, it's very often painful. You know, people have different pain thresholds in different areas of the body, but one of the key things was, you know, you can't do it without some level of discomfort, and it is permanent. It is a kind of reminder of a particular time and place, and really emphasizes that, you know, I am who I am and I'm not going to change, and these physical permanent reminders tie me to that. So there is a sense of claiming. There's certainly a sense of reclaiming for some people. I found this more with some of my female respondents,
Yes.
particularly ones who had been in unhappy, sometimes in abusive relationships, you know, with partners who didn't like tattoos or were very controlling over tattoos. It allowed them an expression to be like, you know, a marker of leaving that stage of their life behind. It wasn't just women, you know, people who had serious illnesses that they'd recovered from, for example. Tattoos can offer a meaning to kind of reclaim the body and reclaim the self from kind of medical professionals, from experts. Absolutely. Back to yourself.
It reminds me, sadly, this never got published. That's a long story of both being a research partner, having miscommunications issues and all that, and me being an independent master's degree student at the time, a master's degree guy at the time. But I once did a research project on people with psoriasis and how they use tattoos. And that's exactly what I found, that a lot of them were like, they almost personified this condition with psoriasis because it can be quite controlling and quite horrible when it's very visible and very flared up. And it can sort of take a hold of people's lives. So a lot of them felt they were taking that back by gaining more control over their appearance.
Yeah, absolutely. And psoriasis as a kind of skin disease is a really good example of, you know, because tattoos go in your skin, you know, and often, you know, I'm not a medical expert. I'm not attempting to say that I am. But kind of living with kind of skin diseases, the treatments that you have to go through, very often the discrimination that people face from others in society, those who can kind of I guess, recover or parts of their skin and then kind of re-beautify it and present it in a different way that's more accepting to them. Has a lot of resonance actually with some of the literature and some of my respondents who use tattooing as a more productive form of expression than self-harm. Sometimes replacement for self-harm, sometimes to cover over scars of self-harm after they kind of left traumatic periods of their life and didn't feel the need to self-harm anymore.
Yeah, I have a friend, not gonna name him because that's very personal, but that has done that as well to some extent. Lots of tattoos other than that as well, but on his arms, there's some that cover up old self-harm scars, and that's very much what he sort of resonated with some of the research that has been done on that with tattoos and self-harm scars. That it made him both. There was that pain, but he had more control over it, but also it gave him a positive thing in that area. That sort of also made him want to refrain physically from ruining that new beautified skin that he had now.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, Michael, because I might be floundering a bit with your theory and term here, but what is the authenticity, like the hunt for authenticity you talk about in your book?
Yeah, I guess I mean, authenticity is this thing that's kind of recognized in everyday life. I use the examples in the book of the computer game Grand Theft Auto. The creators of that game talk about how they used actual gang members to do some of the voices of the characters in there. And of course, the soft drink Coca-Cola, is the real thing. So within society more broadly, I think we are kind of obsessed with authenticity, that people who are really who they say they are, that they're not duplicitous and that they are truly representing themselves. And as I said, some of the academic debates around that are kind of quite complex. But what was key for lots of the people that I spoke to was that given the importance we place as society on authenticity, tattooing very often allowed them to kind of portray this authentic sense of self, not only to others, but also to themselves.
I think that's very important to have in there as well, as you say there, that it's often not just like as a extroverted an expression as tattooing can be at times. It's way more often, at least for what the Beverly and Thompson might call serious collectors or stuff like that. It's way more about the self often. Like they're way more often acquired for the person rather than to just show off to others in a way.
Yeah, I think there's an element of both around it actually. I think necessarily, most people do have tattoos for themselves, to represent their likes and the kind of things that they're into and so forth. But obviously, as a very visual thing to look at, then they're going to be seen by other people.
Yes. Yeah, I think it was a former supervisor of mine for my master's degree that said that it's an inherently social thing as well. Tattoos. It can never just be fully isolated because there will always be at least two people who've seen it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, something that I've kind of thought about is this notion of individuality. Obviously, we are all individuals, and tattoos broadly, notwithstanding the fact that some people can have the exact same tattoos, they lend us a sense of individuality. But individuality is only accomplished in a group context where we're only individual. I'm only an individual because I'm different from you or from my wife or, from my colleagues or from my students. If we're just sat in a room on our own, not socially interacting with anyone, I'm not sure we can claim that we're an individual. I think it's our difference from others that allow us to be individual.
I think you're onto something there because it sort of also loses its purpose in a way in a vacuum. Like there's no need to distinguish yourself if you're the only person there.
Yeah,
So I think you're very much correct there that needs the social aspect. That there needs to be something to compare and contrast to. This actually leads me on to something I was also interested in your book, mainly because, as we talked about earlier, we've both been sort of in the deviant groups, so to speak, a bit more outsiders and nerds and all that in our youth. But you talk about deviancy and normality in your book as well, and that the two sort of can become vehicles for both. I was wondering if you could explain a bit.
Yeah, so one of the things that I found when I was doing my literature reviews, essentially, so, when I was finding out about tattoos, is there's a lot that's been written about tattoos from various perspectives, from criminology, I beg your pardon, from psychology, and of course from sociology and other fields as well. And they tend to either view tattooing positively as a kind of positive aspect of identity formation, or they view them negatively. A lot of the psychology and criminology literature, for example, associates it with kind of psychological deviancy, or with some other form of kind of psychological deficiency. I'm not a psychologist, so I won't get into the kind of what's the word that I'm looking for, diagnosis. And obviously criminology has a long history of associating tattoos with criminology, with criminality. Some of the early work by Lombroso and so forth. So there was basically two camps, tattoos good and tattoos bad. And actually what I found was it was a bit more nuanced than that. The way that people use their tattoos meant that they could present them as somehow normative in certain social situations, and the idea of kind of hiding them, for example, and choosing when to display them. And they could all then be signs of kind of deviancy and a pushback against the kind of mainstream, whatever we might define the mainstream as, in other circumstances. So for me, for example, I had my forearms tattooed, or one of my forearms tattooed, quite early on into when I was getting tattoos. I was only kind of 18, and even that was quite unusual at that point. This was 2000, so this was 24 years ago now. But, if I wanted to work in an office, I could hide it with a shirt. So I could present normally, and as a kind of upstanding everyday member of society. Should I go for kind of job interviews in call centers or offices, as I worked in when I was younger? But then when I was out on a night out, I could wear a t-shirt, and that could show me to be this kind of more rebellious character. And I think that's particularly the case with more kind of overtly political tattoos, for example, and the way they're read. So I think there's been kind of too much focus on kind of normal or not normal, or deviant, depending on what phraseology that you want to use, and not enough focus on the way that actually the way that we read tattoos, the way that we think about tattoos, can actually sometimes be both.
It's very contextually based, at least. As you mentioned yourself, it's very much that, for example, if I go into one setting, it might be very praised that I have lots of tattoos and that. And if I go into another setting, they might still be very, it might possibly a company where they still don't find tattoos very acceptable. Then you suddenly appear more deviant, where it can even be seen as the norm. If you're, for example, if I go to a tattoo convention, I seem way more like the norm there, being tattooed, than anybody that attends it who are just curious and might not have any tattoos.
Yeah, I think an extreme example of this perhaps is something that I use in my teaching. I use a picture of Edward Norton from American History X. And for anyone who hasn't seen that film, he has a big Nazi logo tattooed on one side of his chest. Now, obviously, for most of us, we would consider that very deviant. We would be, find it quite abhorrent, quite offensive. But within the groups that he engages with in this film, it's obviously a fictional piece, but this would be true of real life Nazi tattoos. it lends a sense of legitimacy, that he is
Yeah.
kind of more committed to the cause. So, and would be seen as kind of more normal in that particular situation, and even kind of valued, whereas it would be, I think, by the majority of society, I think, found quite deviant. So I think
It sort of reminds me of Howard Becker a bit with Outsiders.
Yes.
With this, like, it gives different values of amounts of cultural capital depending on who's actually the audience to this thing.
Yeah, it's very Bourdieusian cultural capital. Yes. Very often my students will misunderstand cultural capital as being like, well, the middle classes have cultural capital and the working class don't. But of course, we all have cultural capital.
Yeah.
It's just valued in different ways.
Yeah, I've had that problem with students as well when I taught some undergrads, where they think that cultural capital is this very static thing you can buy and sell, or it's very much not. You could buy the most expensive car in the world, and it might give you less cultural capital with certain groups of people and more with others. It's not just about being rich or from a certain cultural background or
Absolutely, yeah,
anything like that. Which comes back to, like, sort of circles back to both of us. We're both, if I remember correctly from talking with you before, we're both working class backgrounds. And we're both quite tattooed, but we're also both academics. Those all three aspects there gives us different cultural capitals in different contexts.
Absolutely, yeah. So my background, you're right. Yeah, I'm from working class background, and I grew up on a council estate. Like, I guess social housing. I don't know what the equivalent would be in Denmark. Subjectively, I still feel quite working class. That was my upbringing. But of course, by objective measures, I'm a university lecturer. I have a doctorate, so very high level of education. So I would be considered kind of middle class, and my children certainly are middle class and in the middle
I was
class.
set with a bit of groan there, I think, Michael.
Yeah. But that really helped me actually in my research, and I talk a bit about it in the book. Is one of the reasons that I wanted to keep the methodology chapter in the book, because very often monographs won't have a methodology chapter. But I wanted to talk about my experience as a tattooed researcher researching tattooing, because that often helped in the research process, and my class background helped as well, because it meant I was able to kind of converse in a different manner with different groups of people who I studied. So that was quite helpful to have.
There's more of a barrier there sometimes. I at least experienced that more whenever I've been in Britain. There seems to be a bit more of a class divide sometimes in how you speak to people. At times, perhaps. I mean, we do have, despite what some Danes may think, we do have classes in Denmark as well, and there is quite the divide as well here. But I've never seen more of, like, for example, when teaching undergrads, it was almost as if some students thought other students spoke a different language. And there's a few more students that are working class in Glasgow because the undergrads are nationally funded. So you don't pay tuition fee for them. So it's a bit more of a level playing field there than there was when I did my undergrad in England, where we had to pay tuition fee. But
Yes. Yeah.
but I remember, even so, still middle class people there. They still spoke in a way where I understood them because I've been taught, the lingo, so to speak. But for certain other working class students, it was almost as if they were talking a different language.
And I think, I guess we're getting off point from
a little bit, but it's
a bit more sociological, but they are speaking a different language, basically. Basil Bernstein, for any sociologists who are listening, will kind of know about this, the kind of elaborated and restricted speech codes that different classes of children are taught in school. So very often it is a different language that's being taught, and if you're not trained in that language, it can be very difficult to understand.
But I think that translates into tattoos and appearance as well, because that's what I found with some of my students, because they would often want to talk tattoos with me because they see a young, graduate teaching assistant with a lot of tattoos on his arm, so they wanted to talk to me about that. And I noticed that there's even a difference in how they, so to speak, use the medium of tattooing between the different classes. Whereas for lack of a better way of explaining it, the higher class people among the student body who had tattoos, it was almost a way to still show rebellion, and almost a way to still show like, hey, I don't care, it's just laissez-faire, like I'm just gonna get this because it doesn't mean anything and it's just a cool story. Whereas for a lot of the other people that were that were more working class, there was way more of the thing I recognized myself where they just liked tattoos, it seemed. Like they were just genuinely had an interest in this art form in a way.
Yeah, I think historically there's certainly been kind of class divisions in tattoos, although of course going back to what we were saying earlier,
Yeah,
it was very common for the aristocracy and the middle classes to get tattoos at one point in time. It's only really with the invention of the electric tattoo machine and the very easy application and relatively cheap application of tattoos that it kind of turned more towards a working class practice. I think it's kind of, I mean, I don't know if there's any definitive statistics on there. Certainly, I found some people who class was very important for them and they used tattoos as evidence of their class. That was something that I saw when I was doing my ethnographic research. Someone who was kind of a tradesman who was having a tattoo that literally read working class and having some tools of the trade. But I think, you know, like a lot of things when it comes to class, tattooing is a practice that is much more cross-class than I think a lot of people allow for.
I think it's also way more cross-cultural than I think a lot of people allow for. And I don't just mean countries, different cultures here. I also mean cultural groups. Like there's a lot of different, for example, subcultures that all use tattooing, and many people often have a foot in many different subcultures, and they have tattoos that have to do with all their different hobbies and different groupings they associate themselves with, and that. So yeah, it's very much so. It's way more migratory in a way, tattooing.
Yeah,
I think that might be a bad term. That might have been my English failing me a bit, but it's at least not static to the like, oh, you just belong here, so now we get these tattoos. There are, of course, some people that are way more entrenched in one subculture, and then they get tattoos that very much fit with that. But also a lot of people, I think, that get tattoos to do with all sorts of different stuff they like or hobbies and different groups they go and associate with.
Yeah, we're going to have to persist doing this in English. Sorry, Mads, because I definitely.
No, I know. I'm sorry.
But what I was going to say actually is that my original proposal for my PhD thesis, when I submitted it, was to look at how different subcultures use tattooing and the way that different subcultures engaged in tattooing practices. Because, you know, people who are goths use them in a very different way to people who perhaps identify as straight edge, a group that I discuss a little bit in my work. But I moved away from that as I was doing my research, because I found that actually kind of tattooing, the rise in popularity of tattooing meant that kind of lots of people were doing it. It wasn't as restricted to subcultures as it had been kind of previously. You know, the programs that we already mentioned, like Miami Ink and so forth, had opened up tattooing to the general public, if you like. They kind of demystified the practice, and it wasn't just kind of subcultures like alternative music scene that were getting tattoos. It was becoming much more kind of mainstream and accepted, which is why my focus changed. Which isn't to say that different subcultures don't use tattoos in particular ways. You know, there are tattoos that are common to the punk scene, to the goth scene that I mentioned, to interest groups like, you know, comic fans like yourself and so forth.
Yeah. Well, I think absolutely correct that it's sort of it's less poignant to go and look at just how different subcultures use it now, because it is so broadly used and there's so much more fluidness to both subcultures themselves and the barriers they might, the sort of borders of different subcultural groups. But also tattooing is used by so many different people in so many different groups and areas and cultures that it's better to look at tattooed people rather than people within just one subculture who use it.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, I at least think I agree with you. Right? I'm sorry if I'm confusing, Michael. But yeah, but it's still interesting, you know, because I recently spoke to a guy. It's almost interesting to see that there's certain subcultures forming within tattoo culture itself sometimes. of like, oh, these people only get this style done, or these people only want to get this style done. And these camps sort of form within tattooing that don't have anything to do with other subcultures necessarily always, but just,
Yes, I think one of the things that I write about, something you've mentioned a few times about tattoo collectors, that's been written about as a kind of subculture.
yeah.
Although I have to say I'm quite critical of the notion of tattoo collectors, actually. So the from an academic perspective, not from people who want to kind of collect tattoos and go.
No, I get it.
But certainly, I think there is a distinction between those who have tattoos and those who are tattooed, tend to be more heavily tattooed and won't just go to a tattoo artist in their local town, but will travel sometimes internationally, and in order to seek out particular artists. And I think that has developed into a subculture in a way. But actually, I think from an academic perspective, so Kathleen Irwin has written a lot about this. I think that some of the things that she writes about in terms of tattoo collectors and what differentiates them from, if you like, mainstream kind of tattoo people, or people who have tattoos, actually there's a lot of overlap. You know, a lot of people want good tattoos and they want to show them off, and they are prideful of them and so forth. So I think the kind of distinction between tattoo collectors and just people who get tattoos isn't as clear, I guess, as some would argue.
I think you're correct to some extent, but I still think there's, I mean, it's mainly, as you saw in my interview here, there's maybe a pet peeve of my own that I think there's still a difference between some people that get just a couple of tattoos, or maybe just a few tattoos, and people that want to cover their body extensively sometimes. That is of note and worth like exploring at times. But I do agree that when it comes to meaning and identity work, there's a lot more overlap between both categories, so to speak.
Yeah, very, very often the difference between those two groups can be economic means.
That is true. That's also my suspicion of why ignorant style tattoos, as they're called, are so popular among a younger crowd now.
What do you mean by that? Sorry.
It's been titled ignorant style tattoos, but it's often those ones where it's very, very simplistic. Often some people do it at home, some people go to professionals to get it done, but they're very often only one line, just done quickly, maybe just a word or two, or a little sketch image, like very, very simple, like looks like kids' drawings almost at times. Yeah. And I think that they're also increasing popularity, not just because of there might be some culture around them where it seems rebellious again to get that sort of tattoo, but also because it's cheap. And I think a lot of young people want to be tattooed, and then that's the affordable sort of style. And that then if it sort of becomes in within that crowd as well, it sort of draws them in as well. I'm not sure. It's just a stray thought, you could say. But yeah, but I just wonder sometimes, because I'm of course biased. I like my colorful tattoos that take a lot of craftsmanship and a lot of work. So I'll always be a bit biased against the whole ignorant style tattoo craze that are going on right now.
Yeah, I think even tattoos themselves go in kind of crazes and cycles, if you like. You know, we made the point, I've heard you make it previously and I've made it today, that tribal tattooing, and like I said, I'm uncomfortable with the term tribal now, but you know, that as a style of tattooing was what was very popular in the 90s and in the early 2000s, and is often reflected by people who were tattooed during that period. Certainly it's the case for me that I have lots of work that would be described as kind of tribal tattooing. You know, and then we've seen kind of popularity for kind of new school tattoos and old school tattoos and Japanese tattoos. So, you know, I think this is, you know, what we might term ignorant tattoos is just a kind of another phase of popularity for a particular type of tattoo.
I think you're right, because it's very similar to what used to be popular. I think that's where they take the inspiration because it seems more rebellious than like some of the Russian and French prison tattoo books that got very popular at one point in bookstores and that. And so a lot of tattoos that are sort of reminiscent of that ignorant style sometimes in those books. And of course, I mean, if that's the thing, as you say, crazes sort of come and go within tattooing as well.
Yeah, and I also think, if you're trying to search for distinction in tattooing, to try and make yourself an individual and different from other people, tattooing has become so much more popular now. I mean, it's still not a majority practice that, despite claims from some people that they're everywhere. I think.
Oh, I get tired of that sometimes. The claims that every other person has it. No.
Yeah, statistics are very difficult to come by. Of course, they're not collected on the census or anything in the UK, but broad, estimates in the UK at least are between about a third to 50% of the population. So it's certainly not a majority practice.
Oh, absolutely.
You do see it much more now. So I think trying to search for distinctiveness within tattooing can become more difficult now, and that what you're describing could be a reaction to that. I mean, certainly, I mentioned having my forearms tattooed, which was kind of quite rebellious at the time, but now it's very common. You see lots of people with forearms tattooed, and increasingly people move on to what we call kind of academically and within kind of tattoo discourse as public skin. So, skin that you can't hide with a shirt or a jumper. So your hands, your neck, your face, and so forth.
Yeah, that does seem to be like. I can't remember where I read it once, but I did read, I don't even think it was an academic article necessarily, but somebody talking about how that, well, it's gotten to a point now with the rising popularity that if you want to be extreme or like push people's buttons with being tattooed, you need to go further and get more extreme areas covered.
I think that's absolutely true. Yeah,
absolutely.
I think tattoos are such an everyday sight now. Even if not everyone has them, if you walk around any city in the world, probably you will see tattoos on display very readily and very often, that almost people don't think about it that much anymore. So to kind of stand out, I think people are increasingly going for, I made the point, I wanted my hands and neck tattooed for a very long time, and I held off because of job prospects, economic opportunities. But part of my reasoning for wanting that was because it was becoming so much more popular just to have tattoos in general. I mentioned that none of my friendship group were getting tattoos when I was first doing it at kind of 17, 18. But as we reached our 30s, all of them were starting to get tattoos. And I'm like, well, hang on. I would be a bit different. So then you kind of, you go to the next level, I guess.
And you also get people like one of my ex-supervisors for the PhD, where she talked about she felt she was more unique by not having tattoos because she couldn't think of a colleague at least at Glasgow in her department that didn't have at least one.
Yeah, I've heard that argument that, usually from people without tattoos, that actually it's more different to not have them. Although, as we've already said, that, it still isn't a majority practice.
I mean, I think that is based very much in a shock value for them because I can't remember who made this term, but the idea of imagined communities, and you know the people you meet in your own day-to-day life, and that sort of shapes your idea of the world around you. So I think for some people, they might just coincidentally run into more tattooed people, and then they think it's every person getting them, and then they get bored with it. But as you say, and as we both have experienced and read up on, as much as you can get precise with statistics, it's far from everybody. There's still a very large minority now that have tattoos. It's way more than it used to be. So it is way more noticeable, but it's still not everyone or the majority group of society that have tattoos. And especially not because the statistics often just count, do you have one or more tattoos? They often, at least most statistics I've ever read from research, they don't really distinguish, how many do you then have? They just note down who has tattoos.
Yeah, and I think there is some sort of qualitative difference between, someone who might just have, I don't know, a little thing on the inside of their wrist or on their back, compared to somebody who, like yourself, has broadly kind of full sleeves, a tattoo that goes quite far up onto your neck and it is visible in most circumstances. There's certainly a difference in the way those groups get treated, and often that's to do with kind of the concealability or otherwise of tattooing. And I still think, we as humans in general like to play with our identity. The clothes that we wear, the hairstyles that we have. We are a communicative species, and for those of us who have tattoos, that's kind of one of the ways that we like to communicate. I think certainly for me, and I've got a sense of this from your episode with, is it Matt?
Matt Davis,
the psychiatrist, that when you're in a profession and it's not expected for you to have tattoos, having them and the shock value they provide is very interesting sociologically. Before we came on air, we were having a discussion about titles, and I'm not precious about my title. My title is doctor because I have a PhD. I had an appointment earlier, actually, which at a hospital, which is the worst place to be called. And the nurse was asking if I was a medical doctor, and I was like, no, I'm not.
No.
But it is interesting the way that people react, when you're called doctor or whether you're a psychiatrist like Matt, and you don't fit that kind of expectation of how you look. Like, disrupting that kind of norm and playing with it, I think, is kind of interesting from a sociological perspective.
Absolutely. Like, it sort of goes back to the OG, as the young people might say, Goffman, and his talks about stigma and how it's sort of how you fail to meet people's perceived conceptions of something about you, or there's a miscommunication here. And I think you're correct, as I've often thought this myself, that it's often a miscommunication in the socially constructed, I would say, expectations people have of certain fields or areas or arenas, so to speak, and then how you then enter into them. Because, for example, another example is I've been out a lot because I've used to really like drinking and going out and having a fun time. And I've been out both here in the UK and Germany, Sweden, many other countries. Only one country I've been out in so far, that's here in Denmark, have I been banned from entry in bars and that, or kicked out as soon as it gets to a certain part of the night when the doorman shows up, because I have tattoos. That was when I had way fewer tattoos than now. Yeah,
that's something I've experienced. Growing up, I used to go to a lot of kind of rock and alternative clubs where tattoos would obviously be welcome. But in what I would call kind of more mainstream clubs, the type of places you have to wear shoes to go in, you're not allowed to go in with trainers. I've been refused for having tattoos. This was many years ago. When I was much younger, that was kind of commonplace because there was still that association that, if you have tattoos, particularly because I used to shave my head. I've only recently started growing my hair again, so I had a kind of shaved head. That association that you're a kind of football hooligan or that you're going to cause trouble or whatever. And as tattooing has become much more popular and much more mainstream, that has kind of lessened. People recognize that you're no more likely to start trouble or a fight or whatever it is than the next person. Tattoos rarely are a kind of indicator of that, despite what a lot of kind of criminological studies have argued.
Oh yeah. Funny enough, when I spoke to Becky Owens, who says hi, by the way, because she knows she'd been to Sunderland, but when I spoke with Becky Owens, who's a psychologist, she herself, because of all her tattoos, was also very reticent about the at least old school psychology papers, where they very much just say they toe the line to just saying, hey, if you get tattoos, you either are or want to be a deviant or delinquent. Like, you're one or the other. You're either already doing bad stuff or you want to do bad stuff. They almost said the old psychology and criminology texts.
Yeah, I think psychology is an interesting kind of case study in looking at how tattoos have and opinions on tattoos have shifted in the mainstream, because you can see that mapped out in psychological papers as well, in that they were largely condemning tattoos and people who've got tattoos. And now there's a much more balanced view where it's looking at the kind of positive aspects and potentially curative aspects of tattooing as a form of expression.
Yeah, they do. Psychology papers do tend to like to look at the trauma or healing tattoos, you could say, where people often who've been in an accident or who've been victims of sexual assault or other horrifying experiences in their life that leave no small amount of trauma, either physically on your skin or mentally, sort of try to, as we spoke about earlier, reclaim their identity through tattoos.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that there's just more of us with tattoos entering into these positions, and that has a significant impact on kind of demystifying views, as it has done with other what we might call outsider groups as well.
Absolutely.
One of the chapters in my book is about this, and I've published a paper separately about it, that one of the kind of ways that tattooing becomes kind of demystified and norms around it become challenged is that actually people with tattoos start getting jobs as sociologists or psychologists or in the police or whatever it is, and that challenges those long-held assumptions. And that
people meet them in their daily life more.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And that's been the same with kind of other outsider groups, with homosexuality, with women, with racism, all of those things, those norms or these assumptions about these groups have been challenged as they've kind of fought for their rights much more necessarily than people with tattoos. Obviously, there's quite a qualitative difference there. I'm not trying to make a absolute comparison here, but theoretically speaking, what have been outsider groups have been able to enter the mainstream and challenge the mainstream norms and challenge views about them and lend more kind of normality to different groups and practices.
That's the way, like when you see it and it sort of changes your view in a way. Like people saw I remember the guy from NASA that was out because of I can't remember what he'd done actually, but people just remember him wearing this anime button-up shirt and having long sleeve tattooed, but yes, that's also exactly, like, but that also for young people watching that can change the idea of like, okay, because I put it in a positive spin. Somebody more conservative might be like, oh, what thoughts is he going to put into the young people's minds now? They're going to think you could just be a delinquent and be a scientist. But the thing is, as I see it, it means that you don't feel you have to abandon yourself to become this thing. Because I think that happens a lot to people, especially in your generation, other generations older than my own. There was always this expectation that, hey, if you're going to get a career, you need to put some of these things behind you. Because that's just not what you do when you are an adult, in quotation marks.
And I think that's where this notion of authenticity that I write about is important, is that actually, you're still being true to yourself and kind of making your way in the world as much as you can, and you can be successful irregardless.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely, that's what I love the most about that idea when reading your book about authenticity. That's exactly the point, that it's sort of staking your claim to yourself in a way against, because there's a lot of different things in society that pull different directions on you as you try to go through it and make your way through it. A lot of and there's no small amount, at least in my experience, of institutions or other people in your life, family members or friends or acquaintances that will sometimes go, hey, but shouldn't you do this, or shouldn't you hold off on that, or shouldn't you not get tattoos on your hands, for example, as we've talked about, because what are they going to think? There's a reason they still call them job stoppers certain places in the world.
Oh, well, even here, I think, I mean, I was doing my research quite a while ago now, sort of 2010 to 2012. I was doing my primary research, but the phrase job stoppers was very common there, particularly among tattooists themselves.
Yeah.
And often tattooists would be very reluctant to tattoo what we would term job stoppers on people, particularly where they weren't already heavily tattooed.
I mean, even when I got most of mine done in the tens, first half of the tens, here in Copenhagen, the culture was still so that if you didn't know the artist, also because Denmark's one of the only countries in the world that has an actual law prohibiting tattooing people on the hands, neck, and face.
Oh, really?
Yes. They don't prohibit you from having them. They prohibit you from tattooing people, these areas. So it's actually illegal for artists to do that in Denmark still to this day.
Interesting.
But that added onto the cultural conservatism that I often at least recognize in my own country. Sort of added up to that unless you knew the artist really well, they would not tattoo you in any of those areas. Because it might be their neck on the line if any authority caught whiff of it, and they could get a fine, or the shop could be closed, or it was quite there was a lot at stake from it being seen by wrong. I think today it's so common knowledge, even the law is still there. Nobody's really gonna sanction it. Nobody's gonna go out and actually uphold that law nowadays. So there's less of that, way less of that now.
Yeah, it's fascinating that exists actually, because most laws around tattooing aren't to do with the practice itself. Yeah. They are to do with the sanitary conditions. They're normally health and safety laws.
Plus an old law as well. It was the most ironic thing is it's called the King's Law because it was signed in by a king back in the day. Now it's actually our current king's grandfather, because our queen just abdicated.
I was going to say your queen's just abdicated, doesn't she?
Yeah. But before that, it was her father, and he was heavily tattooed, especially for the time. Both arms fully covered, some of the chest, legs were also quite tattooed. I think he had some of the back at the end as well. Frederick IX. But he was actually the king they forced to sign the law. And there's some stories going around that it was because Danish parliament was kind of tired of the whole image the king was getting, because especially when he went to the UK, he would often get a new tattoo, and then the tabloids in the UK would take pictures of him at Gatwick Airport. It was shirtless and stuff like that. That's just an old wives' tale. I at least have not cared to, nor do I do the legwork to confirm or deny that old story.
Yeah, so I think it's still fascinating. There's a specific law that exists about it, though.
Absolutely. But it's interesting because we are the only country in Northern Europe, at least, with that kind of law around where you are allowed to tattoo people. And the law also says that you must be 18. So that's also more rare than one would think, that there's an actual law saying that.
Yeah, I think it is the same in the UK.
Yes.
And
pretty sure about the UK.
Yeah, America as well. I don't think those...
Well, that depends on the state. I know for a fact in Florida, it's one of the only places where it's permitted at 16 or 17 with parental permission.
Interesting. Yeah, and again, I don't know if those are laws specific to tattoos or health and safety type laws to do with kind of body work in general on minors.
I'm not sure. I haven't read enough about that.
Yeah, we are not legal experts, folks.
No. Oh, far from it. If I was a legal expert, I might actually have money. But before we start a whole other episode with you, Michael, we're gonna start rounding off this one a bit, and at the end, sort of to round it off on a lighter note, I would just like to ask you: do you have any advice for any young people that want to get tattoos?
Yeah, I get this a lot actually, and not often people are quite shocked by my response, and I'm like, well, hold off, like don't just jump into it immediately, because tattoos are for life generally. I already mentioned I had some of mine covered over, but I had them covered over with a bigger tattoo.
The way to do it, Michael. The way to do it.
Yeah, tattoo removal is increasingly available. But, you are putting something on your body for life. So you should just try and have a think about it and not just kind of jump in immediately at a very young age, I think. And I think my biggest bit of advice would be, the public skin that we mentioned, really think long and hard about whether you want that done, because we do still live in a society where, as I said, tattooing retains a kind of aura of deviance, that legacy associating it with criminality and with other kind of never-do-well groups still exists, and it often exists between the people who have the power to, restrict or give employment opportunities. So I think, having public skin that you can't hide tattooed is something that should be thought about long and hard.
Even without considering that or the negative stigma that still lingers a bit, I would also add to that, because I fully agree with your advice there, that you even need to get used to how much attention it derives and draws to you. Even positive attention, because that can still be a lot for some people, especially more introverted people, that suddenly people want to touch you or they want to see your arms, they would ask you to take off your clothes or all that sort of stuff to see your tattoos. And of course you can say no, and most people will respect that boundary, but that's still a lot of attention suddenly to get.
Yeah. I think there's a real gendered aspect there as well.
Absolutely. That is way worse for women than it is for men. Absolutely. Yeah. And I say that as a man that has had a few shirts ruined on a night out because people want to see my chest tattoos, but it is still way worse for women. That one, it's always used as an excuse sometimes, and without wanting to get into it too much, there's also the whole lingering idea of tattooed women being more promiscuous that some people still have, all that sort of bullshit that they face.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Michael, finally, I want to just thank you for being on here, first of all. It's been an absolute pleasure to nerd out with you about sociology. I so rarely get to do it, especially about tattoos. And I just what?
Sorry, I was just going to say, yeah, thanks very much for having me. It's been fun. It's been a pleasure. Likewise, I don't get to talk that much to people about tattoos from a sociological perspective.
Oh, it's lovely, isn't it? I envy you that you got to go a bit further sometimes, but my journey is different. But at least we can share our love of sociology and tattoos, man.
Absolutely.
But finally, I want to ask Michael: is there anywhere people can catch you? Anywhere they can keep an eye out for your stuff?
So Twitter, I guess, or X as it is now. I don't use it very often. You can find me on there at Dr. Michael Rees. It's my kind of work-based account. Although, as I said, I don't tend to use it that much. But people can email me. They should be able to find me. So I'm a lecturer at Nottingham Trent University. So my email address should be on the website there. I'm sure you can put them in contact with me if anyone wants to find me as well.
Absolutely. Just as a footnote for my own sake, as I'm also curious, what do you teach at Nottingham Trent?
I teach sociology. So I teach a sociology of the body module. Which I mentioned earlier, I did a sociology of the body module when I did my undergraduate degree, and I was just amazed that you could do sociology around this. And I'm just about to finalize writing a contract for my next book, which is the Sociology of the Body textbook. So mostly looking forward to that. It's a lot of hard work, but I'm looking forward to there being a kind of proper textbook out there. And I teach a lot of social theory as well, because I'm very interested in theory. But yeah, I'm a sociologist. I studied sociology for my degree and for my postgraduate, and I'm still here as a sociologist.
Still here, still around. And as an aside to anybody listening, I still would highly recommend that anybody checks out Michael's book, Tattooing into Contemporary Society. I'm always bad with titles, but I'm pretty sure that's the one.
Yeah, that's the one.
You don't need to get the hardback copy, which I have as a super nerd and friend and fan of Michael's. I couldn't resist, even though Michael graciously actually under the table, as we said in Denmark, gave me an electronic copy at one point. I still couldn't resist and bought the actual book. It is a great book that I would argue is written in a way that you don't need a sociology degree to get something out of this book. It is quite good and quite brilliant. And I think it gets, you can very much tell that Michael himself likes tattoos and has tattoos as well, because it's coming from a very honest angle and perspective at tattoos and looking at them in that way. At least that's my opinion when I wrote it. I tried to, when this comes out, it would have been a few months, to raffle off a couple of copies Michael graciously has given me for people of the softback version of his book. I will do that again by the time this episode comes out. So when you're listening to this, there will be a quick post after this is released about the books again. So I would highly recommend that you throw your lot in for these books.
Thanks very much for the kind words about the book. I guess one of the things that I like is that you say you don't necessarily need to be a sociologist. I think anyone should be able to read sociology, studies.
I agree. I fully agree. That's other than it being about tattoos and me being a bit jealous of some of the stuff you've written there. I would wish I could have written myself. That's exactly one of the things I loved about the book, that it's written in a way that my dad, if he was still keen on reading in English, which he's not, even though he speaks it, would be able to read that. Like, he's barely gone through high school in his life, and he could read that book. Like, it's quite great, honestly.
Thanks for the kind words.
Well, before I embarrass Michael any further, thank you for listening in, anybody, and tuning in, anybody, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Hello, everybody. Inspired by Martin in the episode you just watched, I put on my hoodie for the outro today. What an episode, man. I know it's a bit selfish of me, but I simply love diving in deeper into the sociology of tattoos, especially regarding identity, as we did today. I hope you all learned a lot. I especially identify myself with Michael's concept of this quest or hunt for authenticity through tattoos, which doesn't have anything to do with tying deep narratives to it, as you may have learned from today's story. It's more about loving being tattooed and it being an intricate part of identity. On that note of Martin's theory of the quest for authenticity, I am once again gonna raffle off a couple of copies of Martin's book, Tattooing in Contemporary Society. Now, this is the hardback copy. It will be softback copies that Martin has been so kind as to let me raffle off 2 copies off here on the podcast. For details about how to win a copy of this book, please follow along on the Instagram page of the podcast. There will be more details on that ASAP today when this is published. And the competition will probably run for about a week or so here at the end of March. So please keep an eye on it, and I hope you might enjoy it. Next time, I will be talking to the charming and awesome Paula Castle, very regarded tattoo artist from Britain. And we're going to be talking a bit about both how it is to be a tattoo artist who is on the spectrum themselves, especially being late diagnosed in the case of Paula. Late as in way up in years compared to when some people get diagnosed. And also tattooing people that are on the spectrum possibly, and making space for different marginalized groups in the two worlds, so to speak. It's going to be very interesting. It's going to be a bit more of a sensitive topic, but trust me, it was an amazing episode to record, and it was handled with care, laughter, joy, and deep, awesome thought through discussion. So see you in a couple of weeks, and thank you for listening or watching.